Patriot Financial is proud to introduce the people of Utah to two congressional candidates that the Republicans and Democrats don't want you to know about. Dwayne Vance in Utah's 1st Congressional District and Tim Aalders in Utah's 4th Congressional District. Mainstream media and special interest groups want you to believe that only two options exist, namely the Republicans and Democrats. They also want you to believe that only two people are running in each congressional district, a Republican and a Democrat. It is the belief of Patriot Financial that informing voters about the multiple options available to them gives voters an opportunity to choose for themselves the candidates they think will best represent the interests of the people of Utah in office. You are the best person to decide what is best for you, and sometimes the best path in life is the path seldom chosen. We present to you the two men the establishment and elitists would rather you not know about, Dwayne Vance for Utah's 1st Congressional District and Tim Aalders for Utah's 4th Congressional District.
Welcome to Meet the Candidates Night, sponsored by the Independent American Party. We want to give special thanks to Patriot Financial and Brandon Waters for their significant contribution toward this program tonight. We want you to know that the questions that we're going to ask the two candidates will have come from Facebook and from other media platforms. And through the night, we will also entertain questions from text messages as well as the phone here at the studio. We should note that other candidates have been invited to this event tonight, specifically in the 1st Congressional District, Rob Bishop and Donna McAleer, and they have both declined the opportunity to come. In the 4th Congressional District, Mia Love and Doug Owens have also been invited, and they too declined to come. So with that, we have Tim Aalders, who is running in the 4th Congressional District, and Dwayne Vance, who is running in the 1st Congressional District, both representing the Independent American Party. So let's get to the first question, and the first question which looms out there all the time is why, as lifelong Republicans, Dwayne and Tim, have you specifically chosen to run under the Independent American Party flag? Dwayne, why don't we start with you?
Okay. Well, first of all, just a little bit more explanation about what's happening here tonight. We did invite all of the other candidates who are going to be in our respective congressional races. In the 1st District, for example, in addition to Rob Bishop, the Republican candidate, and Donna McAleer, the Democratic candidate, there is Craig Bowden, who is the Libertarian candidate. And Rob Bishop and Donna McAleer wanted absolutely nothing to do with this. The Democrats and Republicans didn't want to be on the same stage with us, didn't want to debate us. And so it kind of emerged into where Tim and I had been the ones that kind of spearheaded this. We were the ones that had kind of funded this. We thought, you know what? Since the major parties aren't going to play in the same sandbox as us, if you will, we'll just use this as an opportunity to introduce ourselves to the people. And so myself, and Tim has somewhat of a similar background story. I've essentially been a lifelong Republican. Way back when I was in junior high, I was on the Orrin Hatch's Senate Youth Committee and would go to rallies and different events for him, and he's still in office. And quite frankly, that's part of the problem. I've just become a little disenchanted with the party system as a whole. I think the parties care more about themselves than they do the individuals. I've been very disenchanted with the process. I don't know about the rest of the voters out in Utah, but how many times have you gone to the polls on election day and you've looked at the candidates who you have to choose from, and you've been disappointed by the choices you've been given? And quite frankly, I just don't think that our political parties, especially the two dominant ones, the Republicans and Democrats, have been doing a good enough job getting quality candidates on the ballot who will actually represent the people. And in fact, I think the parties kind of get in the way of them representing the people. A perfect example of that is the national debt. When President Bush was in office, whenever he asked to raise the national debt ceiling as a general rule, all of the Republicans raised their hand in favor of it, and all the Democrats, voted against it, saying what a bad idea it was. You change parties in the office of president, and now that President Barack Obama is in the presidency, every time he has to raise the national debt limit, again, as a general rule, Democrats vote in favor of it and Republicans vote against it. And they're just party line votes, and it has nothing to do with the merits of what they're voting on. The national debt's either a good idea or it's a bad idea, and it shouldn't matter which party's in power asking that it be done. And so those are kind of things that I'm trying to get away from. And the Independent American Party aligns with my principles, aligns with my ideals, and has given me access to the ballot and has given me an opportunity to actually represent the people rather than representing special interest groups or representing a party or something like that. Tim?
You know, when I first was approached by the Independent American Party to run, I decided to go ahead and take their offer because they could get me on the ballot. Now, I ran in 2012 against Orrin Hatch among 11 other people. What disappointed me with the Republican Party is that 11 people ran for office, but the Republicans didn't even allow us in debates, didn't even allow our message to be heard. The establishment picked the candidate they wanted, and once they picked that candidate, they just fully supported that candidate, even though there were other Republicans running. Like Dwayne made example of, the Republicans and Democrats, I think some of them actually go to Washington with good intentions, that they have good intent to do good for the state of Utah, the people they represent, but once they get there, the party takes control. And you have to understand, the Republican and Democratic Party spend more on marketing and advertising than the top 10 internet companies on the NASDAQ or Dow Jones. That's a lot of money, billions of dollars going towards marketing to make sure you vote for who they want you to vote for. So as independent Americans like George Washington and others, we're independent Americans. That's why I chose to run in as independent.
Well, let me ask you this question. How would you respond to people that would say that voting for an independent could cost conservatives a seat, could create a split in a vote, or otherwise be labeled as wasting your vote? How would you answer that, Tim?
You know, I sit and I look at it, and I had a conversation with a gentleman in my neighborhood who asked me that same question. Tim, why would you want to split the vote and maybe harm me a love? And I'm like, you think it's wasting your vote? And he said, yes. And I said, well, when haven't you wasted your vote? And he goes, what do you mean? And I said, well, ask yourself this. When was the last time Republicans voted or started a piece of legislation that improved your quality of life? Many of the programs we have that are detrimental to our quality of life, to our society, came from the Republicans. When have they lowered your debt? When have they lowered the debt that they're piling on our posterity? None of them has done it. We have two parties, neither one of them are good. So the only way you're not going to waste your vote is to vote for somebody who might work opposite of the two parties. Dwayne?
And with that, you see a trend nationally that's actually playing out here at home in Utah as well. I believe back in 2012, the last presidential election, Gallup did a poll as far as party affiliations on a nationwide basis. And I didn't bring any notes here today. We're just talking off the top of our head and speaking from our hearts. But my best recollection is that independents, in fact, I know this is true. I just don't know the percentages. The people who identified themselves as politically independent were the majority. It was like either 42 or 43%. And then below that in the 30s somewhere were people who identified as Democrats, and then below that were people who identified as Republicans. When you go to the state of Utah, I spent some time on the Lieutenant Governor's website just this last week looking at the registered voters. And if you look at the numbers of people in Utah specifically who are registered voters, there are just as many independents as there are Republicans. In fact, the numbers are so close, I actually ran the numbers. This one I do remember. It's 44.5% of registered voters in Utah are independent, 44.7% of registered voters in Utah are Republican, and like 9-something are Democrat, and then the rest of the parties, fill up the last few percentage points. But even that's a little misleading because on at least an anecdotal basis, I've talked to a lot of my friends and associates who are registered as Republicans that, quite frankly, don't necessarily believe themselves to be Republican. That's just so they can vote in the primaries. That's just so they can go to a caucus if they want to. But they don't necessarily feel allegiance to the Republican Party when it comes to voting, and very rarely vote straight party ticket. So in Utah, I would propose that the majority of the people are now independents, and they're looking for the right candidate. And the fact that if you vote for an independent or if you vote for a third-party candidate, that you'll split the vote and allow a liberal to be elected instead of a conservative, quite frankly, I think is a myth perpetuated by the Republican Party, because they don't want you to vote for anyone but the Republican candidate, regardless of who that Republican candidate is, regardless of that candidate's track record if they're the incumbent. And the reality is, if people in Utah would simply vote their conscience, especially in the first district in which I'm running in, which is one of the most conservative districts in the nation, not to mention the state, if the people would just vote their conscience, the reality is that instead of a Republican getting voted in, a third party or an independent would get voted in. It would still be a conservative. We're not going to split the vote. We're not going to allow a liberal to get elected instead of us.
Well, let's go to an issue that hits home here in Utah. Many people feel very adamantly about this issue with Common Core. What's your stand on Common Core, and how would you address that if you were elected, Dwayne?
With Common Core, there's a couple of things to keep in mind with that. First of all, Common Core was actually developed by a lot of educators within individual states that came together. And then the federal government kind of picked up the ball and ran with it from there. You hear talk about how Common Core is voluntary, and to a certain extent that's true. States don't have to adopt Common Core, but if they don't, then they don't get the federal funding that goes with that. In fact, I had this conversation with a candidate for I believe it was the State Board of Education at a campaign event just a couple weeks ago, when I asked her opinion on it point blank, especially being an educator on the State Board of Education. And she said the reality is that we can't do without the money, and people don't want to hear that. And quite frankly, I think Common Core is one of many things that the federal government, education, let me put it that way. The education of our children here in the state of Utah, of our students, is something that I don't think that the federal government should be involved in. I think it goes beyond the limited scope of authority granted to the federal government by the Constitution. But it's the funding that we have to go after, and it all gets back to getting the federal government out of those type of programs, period, and out of taxing us for those programs, and out of holding out that funding as a carrot. We've got to pull back those tax dollars as well as pull back the control to the state level.
Tim, how would you answer that?
Well, Dwayne did a pretty good job. There's a couple things I'd like to add. When you look at Common Core and you look over at what they're doing in other states, California, New York, other places, they're starting to put things that don't meet Utah values. They're starting to teach history with gay history and other items that people in Utah really don't want taught to their children. Another thing people need to recognize is with the 50 states, we have 50 laboratories of innovation. We have the ability to compete with one another. That's how the founders intended it. They intended it that if Utah was doing something right with education, our children would score higher than children from South Carolina or Florida or California or Texas. And then they'd look at our state and say, what's Utah doing that's making their children so bright and so intelligent? And they would mirror what we're doing, and they'd improve upon that. And we'd have all this innovation that is making our children, once again, the best and the brightest among the world. Since the Department of Education came around and we leave it to the federal government, our education system has dropped. We're not ranked as high as we should be. And our intelligence of our children is dropping. We're caught up more with the toys and the internet and the Netflix and all these other things that are detriments to our children, and we're not just educating our children. Let the teachers, the people in our communities, educate the way they feel is best for their children. It's better off closer at home.
Well, let's address another issue. There seems to be a fair amount of let's live according to our conscience instead of living according to religious freedom. There's been a number of attacks, most recently in the news, relative to religious freedom. The examples are that in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, there has been a pastor who has been relatively forced by a civil group to try to perform same-gender marriages. In Houston, Texas, we've had a group of pastors that have been asked to turn over their sermons because it's termed hate speech. So what's your stand as it relates to consciousness versus freedom of religion? Dwayne, how about if you start?
Well, with that, when you get into the labels and semantics, whether it's labeled, freedom of consciousness or freedom of religion, it all comes down to a belief system. And the one thing that I'm absolutely opposed to is imposing your belief system on anybody else. In fact, that's what this country was founded upon. When they talk about freedom of religion in the Constitution, it's not freedom from religion, it's freedom of religion. They wanted to avoid a state-imposed religion or a state-imposed belief system, if you will. And right now we've gone exactly the opposite direction, where you've got people with their own belief system, whether you call it religious, whether you call it their own consciousness or beliefs or whatever, that are basically imposing that upon the rest of us. I have my own belief system. I'm not going to impose that on somebody that doesn't want to, and it really offends me when these people try and impose it on us. And that's exactly what's happening with those examples that you just gave us with up in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, and then down in Texas, where these pastors are being attacked. I've actually seen instances in Texas where I've heard about them. I haven't seen them. I haven't been down there, where pastors have been told you will perform, gay marriages, same-sex marriages, or face fines or jail. And if these people want to if there are people who want to have same-sex marriage, although that's not something I personally believe in, they're welcome to do that, and I'm sure that they can find plenty of pastors, ministers, people who will perform that ceremony for them. For them to take the extra step and say, no, we want this pastor in this religion to perform this ceremony just because we know that pastor or that minister is against it, and we're basically shoving it in his face and forcing him to do something against his own belief system, that's where I think it really draws a line, and that's where it's really gotten out of control. And we need to rein that back and get to freedom of religion and allow everybody to have their own belief system without persecuting others and without imposing it on others.
I look at this argument, and we've had many discussions about this argument on the radio. Listen, this is the fact. The Constitution left certain powers to the federal government. Marriage wasn't one of them. And in fact, the Constitution states that civil rights, issues of that sort, should be handled by the states, because states have different value systems. States have a different morality. When our Constitution was created, it was for a moral society. That's the only way we can hold our republic together. Now, our founding fathers warned us against that. And it was the First Amendment came about because we had colonies that were Lutheran or Presbyterian or Catholic. They all had different value systems. What they didn't want is the federal government imposing a certain one rule, one religion, like the English church, on the colonies. So it was always meant to be a state issue, that if the states wanted to have a certain moral issues and take up the moral issues, then they could. Marriage is one of those items. And it's like I've always said, this isn't about, to me, about the rights, because I believe everybody should have the right to do with what they want. But it goes far beyond rights when they're trying to force people or sue people to accept what they're doing as right. Your freedom ends where somebody else's begins. And it's not that they just don't want us to acknowledge the fact that they can get married. They want us to have to perform them. And if we don't believe in it, they want to be able to sue us. If we don't want to bake a cake for their wedding, they want to be able to sue us. If we don't want to photograph their wedding, they want to sue us. There's no legal grounds for them to do that. People have the right to be politically incorrect. You don't have the right and freedom to be offended. You have the right to get married or have the unions you want, but it should be a state's issue, not a federal issue.
So because our time is limited, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions that are really just yes-no questions, and we'd like to hold it to that real quick. And we'll ask some other opinion questions when we come back from the break. But let me ask you quickly, are you in favor of deficit spending?
Absolutely not.
No, but that's not a yes or no question. I want to explain it.
Well, we may have an opportunity to do that later. Do you believe in God?
Tim?
Yes.
And I do as well, absolutely yes.
Do you believe in states' rights over federal rights or powers?
I'm not fond of the way that's phrased, because there are certain limited powers that are given to the federal government. And within the scope of the Constitution, I think the federal powers trump state, but it's expanded far beyond that, and I think states' rights control and everything not specifically granted to the federal government in the Constitution.
Do you like the premise of redistribution of wealth? A question that we'll get into after the break, but a quick yes or no, yes and no.
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 Okay, a couple of things to just remember. This is Meet the Candidates Night, and we will be here again next week as well, and that'll be Tuesday at 8 p.m. We'll be right back after this message.
Hi, I'm Sammy, and my mom's gonna bake me a cake. But she doesn't think she needs to follow the recipe. This is a cake my mom baked me without following the recipe. Would you let your kid eat this cake? The Constitution is like a recipe for running our country. Some people back in Washington think they can run our country without following the recipe in the Constitution. Do you want your kids growing up and living in a country in which the leaders don't follow the Constitution?
Hi, I'm Dwayne Vance, and I'm running for Congress in Utah's 1st Congressional District.
And I'm Tim Aalders, and I'm running for Congress in Utah's 4th Congressional District.
We are unabashed champions of the Constitution.
We believe that our Constitution was divinely inspired.
We firmly believe that our elected officials in Washington have a sacred duty to diligently follow the recipes set forth in the Constitution for running this great nation.
Rather than being so presumptuous as to think they can do it on their own by ignoring the sage guidance found in this magnificent document.
On November 4th, please vote for Dwayne Vance for Utah's 1st Congressional District.
And remember to vote for Tim Aalders for Utah's 4th Congressional District. And make sure to elect other people who will make the federal government follow the U.S. Constitution.
I'm Dwayne Vance.
And I'm Tim Aalders.
Candidates for U.S. Congress.
We don't approve of what's going on in Washington,
but we do approve of this message.
Hi, I'm Sammy, and my dad's gonna build me a bike. But he doesn't think he needs to follow the instructions. This is the bike my dad built me without following the instructions. Pretty cool, huh? Would you let your kid ride this bike? The Constitution is like a set of instructions for running our country. Some people back in Washington think they can run our country without following the instructions in the Constitution. Do you want your kids growing up and living in a country in which the leaders don't follow the Constitution?
Hi, I'm Dwayne Vance, and I'm running for Congress in Utah's 1st Congressional District.
And I'm Tim Aalders, and I'm running for Congress in Utah's 4th Congressional District.
We are unapologetic champions of the Constitution.
We believe that many of our country's problems can be solved in large part by simply following the instructions in the Constitution.
Especially when it comes to our bloated federal bureaucracy and the related spending that has created a crushing national debt.
We don't want our legacy to our children to be a crippling national debt that will impair their pursuit of happiness.
On November 4th, please vote for Dwayne Vance for Utah's 1st Congressional District.
And remember to vote for Tim Aalders for Utah's 4th Congressional District. And make sure to elect other people who will make the federal government follow the U.S. Constitution.
I'm Dwayne Vance.
And I'm Tim Aalders.
Candidates for U.S. Congress.
We don't approve of what's going on in Washington,
but we do approve of this message.